And welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jayme Wojciechowski, and I am here with Janelle Ryan and Marilyn Brown. And today we are talking about what racism looks like in 2016. Um, so the first thing I'd like to talk about is what everyone's talking about is Colin Kaepernick and everything that's going on with the protests that are happening now amongst many different sports teams at all levels, from professional to just little league. Communities and all that stuff. What are your, I guess, first, what's just your opinion on everything that's happening? We'll start with Janelle.
I agree with it 100%. I mean, I think that what allegedly makes this country great is that we have the freedom to protest and we have the freedom to express our opinions, our First Amendment right. And I'm so excited to see so many veterans coming to his defense and, restating the fact that, I didn't put my life on the line for some inanimate object or just some inanimate object or a jingle, which is a little racist, might I add, but we'll get into that, later. But I think it's so cool. And even just this week, a really great example of it is that there was a veteran turned law enforcement officer this past week from West Virginia. I forget his name, but he put his life on the line as a police officer to hopefully save a Black man that was suicidal. And when two other officers arrived on the scene, they shot and murdered him. And the cop who decided to put his life on the line and actually try to save him, he was fired. And, it's kind of a testament to how veterans are treated in this country. I feel like him being a veteran, he kind of saw something in this man and decided to try to talk him down. And, then you have these other two officers arrive on scene and they're like, they fired him because he failed to eliminate a threat. And it's like, people are so quick to say that Kaepernick is not respecting veterans, but by taking a kneel, he is standing up for the rights of veterans as well. So it's very interesting to me seeing like all these different things come into play. And it's unfortunate when people who don't tend to think critically, their visceral reaction is, oh, well, you're just respecting the United States. But I have a lot to say about it. That's what first comes to mind.
Yeah, and for me, I agree 100% with it as well. I think that exactly this is what our country was founded on. He has a right to do so. We're supposed to be free enough to be able to protest, and it's so interesting because so many people spoke out about this on Facebook. I was amazed at how many people, and on the different social media outlets, so many people who've been so quiet about racial injustice spoke about so vehemently about how disrespectful this was, how awful it was that Colin Kaepernick did this. And it just really, to me, shows the root of the problem itself. It's that nobody's speaking out when there's this injustice and people are getting murdered, but we're speaking out over fabric. It just really, it really struck me. And yeah, that part just really struck me about it. And I think that, Colin Kaepernick, a lot of the criticism that people had for him also was saying things like, put your money where your mouth is. Why, he needs to do something that's real. He needs to, he can protest, but he needs to do it in a way that's meaningful. Mind you, he did put his money where his mouth is. And he wasn't just doing this for attention, as people criticized him of doing. And it's just so interesting how there's no right way to protest injustice against Black people in this country, against Black and brown people. I think that was what I got out of it, was that there's no right way to do that you're not going to be criticized for.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because I think what happened was, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for years now, but it's, especially in the media, it's still kind of reported on through a white lens. if it's reported at all. It tends to only be reported if there's violence or if there's some kind of angle they can use for whatever to get ratings, let's be honest. So I think this was interesting, and why there were so many negative reactions is because it was in a place where people couldn't ignore it, in a way that they couldn't either ignore it or kind of pass it off as separate from them. Like when you see the protests and things, if you're not in those cities, it's still something you can easily kind of just ignore or not take seriously because it's not directly affecting you. Where, I mean, how many people watch football? So I think that's where the initial reaction, I think that's where it came from, was the how dare he actually say something or make a scene or do this while I'm watching my sports team or whatever it is. I don't think it was. Right. I think that's all. Most of that's subconscious. I don't think people are aware they're doing that. But I think that's where it came from.
I think you're right on with that. And that's what makes it such an effective protest. You know, is that it hit people when they didn't want to see it. It hit people in a way where they weren't able to avoid it. And I think that's what makes it so effective, because we're still talking about it and it's still such an important part of conversation. How many weeks has it been now that he first did it and they first started talking about it? It's been like 2.5 weeks, something like that. So it was pretty effective.
I find it to be hilarious. I had the same reaction when Beyonce performed at the Super Bowl. To me, I'm just watching the performance and I'm like, oh, this is such a dope performance, and then I start hearing all these things about how Beyonce's disrespecting police. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, did we see the same performance? Like, and so then when I heard what Kaepernick did, I was like, oh, that's really cool. That's really dope. I didn't think it was that big a deal. It didn't even dawn on me that it was that powerful initially until I started seeing people's reactions. And then I was like, oh my God, like, people are so angry about this. I was like, it's not even that serious. And I guess like you said, Marilyn, that's what makes it so powerful, is that it's disrupting the status quo. Like, it doesn't, like, their status quo, like, it doesn't disrupt me at all. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. But for them, it's like, how dare you, come into my, safe space. Like, they love to make fun of people who talk about safe space, but that is their safe space. And it's like, it's being, they can't help but look at it, because this is their escape.
Yeah. And I wonder how many people actually, the first time it happened, noticed or had a visceral reaction to it, and how much of it was actually created outrage. If it was like one or two conservative think tanks that kind of released it, and then the mainstream media picked it up, and then all of a sudden people were all outraged. Because the only people I know who are outraged about it, I didn't hear anything about their outrage until a week or two in, when the narrative was already created. So I'd have to do research on who actually initiated the outrage, or if it was just an explosion on Twitter. But I'm pretty active on Twitter too, and I remember seeing a little, but nothing extreme until like 3 weeks later, and then all of a sudden it was all over Twitter. And I think it's interesting too, because I think people miss the reason I think that the whole narrative against it's just manufactured and not really based on what people say it's based on, is that if you do any research on what actually happened, all their points are just not valid, because they talk about it being disrespectful. And yeah, it might disrespect some people, but he sat for the first week or two, and then he actually met with veterans, and the veterans told him exactly what we're talking about. They said, we this is what we fought for, but you can do both things. You can show us respect, and you can protest for what you care about by taking a knee instead of sitting. And he did it. And that's pretty much when I started seeing a lot of other people joining in, was when he started kneeling as opposed to the sitting. So then that whole, it's disrespectful thing is out the window. So if you're continuing that narrative, you either don't know that information, or you don't actually care about that issue.
Right.
I think they don't actually care, and they don't care to learn either, because as you just described, Kaepernick met with veterans and listened to different people and changed the way in which he did his protests. And even, you know, I don't know if this was his intention at first, but because he's received so much support and there were so many people saying they were going to protest him or, you know, write the NFL or whatever, his jersey is one of the most sold jerseys now because of his protest. And he's now taking that money and donating it to organizations and people in need. And it's like every rebuttal that they've given him, you know, he has answered for it. But yet these same people won't take a second and do a little bit of research as to why he's doing this, or, you know, even entertain the fact that I may not agree with why he's protesting, but can I at least agree with the fact that we should defend his First Amendment right? It's just very interesting.
Yeah, Jesse, I don't know if you saw the video from Jesse Ventura.
Yeah.
But I thought it was very powerful, because his overriding message was it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree. We can have that conversation on the side, but we should all, if we're actually for freedom and for democracy, we have to understand that what he's doing is actually very American, and 100% within his rights, and we should be celebrating that. And we can have the conversation about what he's protesting and what the ramifications are on the side, but it shouldn't be in connection with if what he's doing is right or wrong. But I want to just segue a bit, because I posted a few comments on Facebook and got some interesting reactions. I posted things that I didn't think anyone would really disagree with, just about more systemic racism, and how because of our media, because of just our culture in general, and how long we've had these issues, how ingrained it is in our society, and how really no one in America isn't conditioned in some way to be racially biased. And a lot of people reacted very negatively to that. And when I tried to understand where they were coming from, it seemed like they were coming from this place of they didn't like being called racist. That they have this idea stuck in their mind that racism's the KKK and slavery and these extremes, and their ego gets in the way when you use that term, because they think, well, I'm not that hateful. It's not a conscious thing I'm doing, and they're not even aware that there's subconscious things happening. But I think the point of what I wanted to discuss is what racism actually looks like today, because it's not those things. It's the much more subtle things, and I think that's a harder fight to have, because most of those things are subconscious to most people.
I mean, to me, it can be as subtle as, you know, you posted what you thought was a very neutral, understanding, you know, reflection of what you feel like is happening. And when people are so quick to say, well, I'm not racist, you know, or, you know, I didn't own slaves, or whatever the case may be, when it's like, okay, try to look a little bit more deeply into what Jayme is saying. Perhaps try to learn something from what Jayme is saying. But it's like people are just so, I don't even know what the word is. They're just so defensive. And then it's kind of like, if you're so defensive, maybe you really are racist. You know, like if the shoe fits, as they say, or, you know what I mean? Whoever smelt it, dealt it. It cracks me up when people get so angry. If, like, you speak about privilege, or, you know, not all men, or whatever. It's like, or not all white people, or whatever the case may be. It's just like, I wish people would take a moment and just reflect.
Yeah, and I think what happens, what I see with a lot of people, is that if you point out privilege, then you're also, I think that the other side is that they assume that means that they didn't work for what they've earned, that they didn't have a difficult life, that they didn't struggle, you know. And I think that that's part of the problem, is that if I point out that you have privileges that I don't because of your skin color, then I think people were so, like Janelle said, defensive, and we automatically, you know, there's this fear reaction of, what are you saying about me? And I think that's the problem, is that innately as humans, we tend towards that reaction, and it can create a big barrier to actually listening to what people are saying and to what someone's personal experience was, you know. And I try to tell people all the time, your privilege, you don't have to be sorry for your privilege. Like, you don't have to feel guilty about your privilege. You don't have to feel sorry that you have it. It is what it is, but just recognize that it's there, be aware that it's there. And I think even that is really difficult for people.
And I think that's like you said, an innate human thing, because I even remember I was at a Black Lives Matter protest in Los Angeles, and the crowd at this particular protest kind of surprised me, because it was probably half white, which is the most white people I've seen at any of the protests. I mean, it was very apparent. And at one point, we were all just in a circle. Everyone was there, and people were going in the middle and like telling their stories. And a few people who were in the center made generalizations, just saying like white people or whatever. And there would be one or two white people who would feel a need to say, well, not all white people were here. And my reaction to that is, well, I mean, your ego got in the way, as opposed to trying to understand where they're coming from. They're making a mass generalization based on how they feel the oppression is. They're not actually pointing a finger at you. Like, right. And if you take it that way, you're actually, I mean, you showed up to a Black Lives Matter protest, and now you're making it about you and not about the actual thing people are gathered to fight and talk about and build awareness for. So it even happens with allies. So it is a hard thing to do, because the ego is just it's just super strong.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think sometimes I have even more of a difficulty finding that middle ground or discussing certain things with allies. And I don't know, you know, if it's kind of, again, that ego of feeling like I'm not racist. I'm an ally. I consider myself an ally. And because of my experience as an ally, you know, I don't know if there's just certain assumptions that are made, but I find that sometimes it's more difficult to have those really honest and authentic discussions with people who consider themselves an ally, because there's almost more tendency to like personalize examples that I might give or things that I might talk about.
I agree. Even people who don't even necessarily proclaim that they're an ally, but I see this term sometimes circulating in the social justice movement, like that idea of like nice white people, the type of white people who, you know, I have tons of black friends, or I have a black brother-in-law, or, you know, I hire black people, and, you know, I love black music and black, you know, sports players and athletes and stuff like that. And, you know, they're so nice. But like, if you know, dare to have a conversation in your work environment around them, or, you know, at the dinner table or whatever, they're so quick to be like, you know, well, that's not me. You know, I'm a nice white person. You know, I'm not racist at all. And it's like, okay, but we're having a conversation about, you know, something in general. And, you know, perhaps you could learn something from it, or perhaps you have those innate tendencies to do racist things, even though you have, you know, a black wife or a black friend or whatever the case may be. I think we've talked about this on one of our other panel discussions, but one of the biggest problems, I think, with making any change in this world is that we don't listen to each other at all. You know, and it's not everybody, but it's like, I know I've done it before, you know, when you're even in an argument with a loved one, you know, you're not listening to one another because you're too quick to take everything personally and to, you know, not think critically about their situation and how the way that you act affects their situation. So I feel like if we were able to just listen to one another, just shut up for a second and listen, we'd be able to make a lot more bigger changes.
Yeah. And I think that the people tend to listen to people who look like them. And that's just kind of one of the realities that creates a barrier, is that I've seen, myself say something, and I could say the same thing as my friend who's white, and someone listens to her more, if that person is white themselves. There's that innate kind of, again, I don't know if it's just natural, but that can create a barrier as well. And so I think people, who do feel like they have, a voice to speak on this, allies speaking up can be one of the most powerful things, because I think that there is just this innate, people do not listen to people who look like me about this stuff as openly or as easily as they would someone that looks like them.
Yeah. So how do you feel about, on that, I think it's interesting because with mindful activism, that's a big part of what I like to talk about, is the importance of listening. And I think it's especially important when you are an ally of a cause who's not directly affected by that cause, because you will obviously learn more and understand more by listening to people who are directly affected by it, than listening to yourself because you haven't experienced it. And on the, I guess, allies speaking out or talking to other people, what do you think the best way to do that is? Because normally what I say is to share not that I say, what I do is I like to share the stories of people who are affected. So I will, every once in a while I'll write what I personally feel, but the vast majority of the time I'd rather share someone else's story that actually has a story based on what I'm talking about than just my opinion. Do you think that just, let's say, a white person sharing a black person's story gives that story more weight, or do you think that it actually should be more of allies talking about their own opinions?
I think it needs to be both, because I don't think that it's Black people's responsibility to constantly have to educate everybody on their plight. I mean, there's so much information out there available at your fingertips. Speaking of football, like the same way you could look up football stats and you can look up anything online. Like, do research. Jesse Williams, I love bringing him up because he's like my favorite artivist that there is. He said in one of his interviews that if you are a white person who doesn't know any Black people in real life, like, chances are you're probably going to be racist, at least a little racist, because the only representations of Black people you're going to know are what's in the media and et cetera. And I'm using that example because when the only transgender people that I knew of up until a few years ago, before I became friends with someone and discovered after the fact that they were transgender, was in the media. And so, I knew of RuPaul, and I knew of who isn't actually a transgender,
right? Yeah.
Which again is a perfect example. Laverne Cox and stuff like that. So once I started to learn more about their personal experience, I started researching like crazy, to learn more about what that community is going through. And I learned that, for example, that there's issues between the LGBTQ community towards the transgender community and just all these different things. And it's like, I guess to me, that's how I am. I want to learn more about the people around me and how to make sure I don't offend anybody and don't have any innate, anti-transgender, ways about me. And I wish, again, that once again, people would listen. I listened to what my friend had to say about what they were going through, and I immediately decided to research like crazy. And so I feel like it's actually not Black people's responsibility to have to do that. It is everybody else's responsibility to educate themselves on what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's, that's actually called activist research. And I think that's an interesting thing because I feel even with information, we as a society tend to be very dualistic and partisan, where people either get hyper intellectual and they only care about the statistics, and then they disregard people's personal experience because the statistics say something else. Or you have the opposite extreme where people don't care about any of the statistics or any of the facts. They only care about their personal experience or the personal experience of people they directly know. And it is about finding that balance, because then you actually can find solutions. And what activist research is basically looking at the data, but immersing yourself in the culture or in the events of what you're researching. So it's like those two things combined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just what I was going to say is I think blending the two, doing the research, the statistics are definitely there, the information is there. And then when you have more information, going out and finding a way to actually meet people and talk to people in your life. If you don't know any Black people in your personal life, then find some. We're everywhere. You know what I mean? And I know that certain communities are very, very, very segregated, but even just going in and spending time in a community center on a different side of town, you know, and meeting people that way. So I think it's just, it has to be, a combination of both. But like Janelle said, it's not on Black people to do that.
Yeah.
You know, we've been here for a very, very, very long time. So you can find out, what's going on. Like, it's not, we're this new, alien culture that kind of like just popped up here. So,
and we live in,
and I don't know how much, I don't know how much more can be said. I feel like just in the last 2 to 3 years since the Black Lives Matter movement has started, what else is there to say? I mean, to me, it's very simple, but
But it's what you said earlier. It's not. I mean, people need to start listening. There is no more to say until people listen.
Yeah.
But I think it's also easier because of social media. Like, you don't, even if you're in an area that's vastly white and everybody looks like you, same class and stuff, you can go online and learn about other cultures, other races, other anything. You can go on YouTube and see people's personal stories. You can look at articles. Like, I think it makes a big difference when I am doing my research and I'm looking at an opinion piece. I look at who the author is. So many people don't, because that depends. If if I'm looking at an article about Black Lives Matter, I tend to put more. I have like a list of where I put the weight. If it's a Black person in the movement, they are at the top of what the weight I give it. And then if it's a white person who's actually active in the movement, they get weight too. If it's someone who's just a commentator, I don't really give it much thought. I'll read it, but I'm more cautious with that information. I don't think people really in our country they just take in information. They don't really challenge information, see where it comes from. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
I'd love to actually ask you a question, Jayme.
Sure.
So, I know that like you work a lot in the entertainment industry, you're an actor, and you also do a lot of activism. And I know that those two worlds, they often blend together, but oftentimes they're very separate. And I want to know, like, because me personally, I find it difficult sometimes, being that I have to deal with so many different types of people who, do not have the same views as I do at all, like not even close, down to, someone who thinks, exactly like me, if not extremely close. And I know that you're very vocal about stuff that's passionate to you. How do you deal with, those two worlds together? And like, do you sometimes find it to be difficult, doing your activism work and also, working on television shows occasionally that might not align completely with what you believe in or whatever the case may be? I'd love to know, like, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard. I think it's less difficult with TV and film work than it is with commercial work. But me personally, I'm very selective with what I'll audition for commercially. If I don't agree with the product or I don't agree with the morals of the company, I just won't go. And I luckily have an agent who's understands and thinks that's important. Um, I think a big just Hollywood is very weird because it's very liberal, but yet it's very white, and it's not necessarily it's not the actor's fault, but it's hard for the actors to feel empowered because most are liberal, but I mean I can go to 10 acting classes before I find an actual person of color in a class. And it's multi-level because the I assume there's less people of color who actually pursue acting because they see less opportunity for them, and there's less work and all this stuff. So my focus has very drastically gone towards creating my own work. I started a production company where we develop and produce our own content. And one of the big thing is diversity and telling stories that we're not seeing on TV and film. Marilyn's also joined us. So yeah, I think that's important, and that's how I let it go hand in hand with the activism part, because I want to act in stories I believe in and in stories that I think can help people both understand things intellectually, but also be an outlet for people who don't see themselves or their stories already represented on TV or film. And I think it's just a great time. Like I would say, if to anyone who feels it doesn't matter if you're of color or if you're LGBT or what a woman in general in the industry, we just have so many resources now as actors to really take control of our own career like we never had before. You can create your own shorts and your own TV shows and your own indie films. You can do all these things. So I would just challenge actors to really think about what inspires them artistically and make it happen. Find people who share that vision and collaborate and just work. I think a lot of I don't want to get too much into the acting world of things, but it's easy to get into, well, I just audition and then people hire me. And we just have a lot more power than that now. And directors have it and producers have it. Everyone in the industry has it. And I think with Hulu and Netflix, that's where it's moving. Things are diversifying, and I don't think they're diversifying because of the networks and the heads of studios. I think it's diversifying because the creatives are demanding it and are saying, well, if you don't want what we want to create, we'll go to this other outlet and do it ourselves. So yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
And I think it's a lot with I think it's any art you do as an artivist. It's just being true to yourself. And I think as being an actor and also having that brand as well as being an activist, you do have to be smart in the kind of activist that you are. And I think of like Shailene and other people who are very, very Rosario Dawson, people, who are very strong activists for many causes. What we kind of all have in common is that it's about the cause and about finding solutions. We don't really get into the politics as much as the politics of things. Like I'm not going to discuss and debate people on politics because I don't care. I don't care about the conservative, progressive, like none of that matters to me in the world of activism. It's about the cause. And I find when you are focused on the cause and not in these partisan kind of ideologies, people are much more receptive. Because I look at just on Twitter, my following is very across the board, and it shocks me sometimes. But I have a lot of people who have Trump 2016 as their picture that follow me and like things that I post, and it's about the causes, and it's weird because in my mind I'm like, that's interesting because your presidential candidate doesn't support this cause, but you probably don't support that cause politically because you're in some partisan trap in your mind that you can't to do this thing, or how it's all to me, politics is all about manipulation at this point, especially the way the media does it. It's about creating sides, and
It's conditioning.
it's not. And then you actually go to the front lines of these different movements, and it's not about politics. It's about the actual people that are involved. And I mean, that's what acting or filmmaking is. I have a lot of people tell me that I should write about politics, and I'm like, well, I'm writing stories about real people. That's what drives the actual issues, and that's what I care about. So it strangely goes together if you focus on the activism. It's when you get into the politics that I think things get a little messy.
Yeah. No, I agree. I guess for me personally, the biggest issue I find, at least in the industry, is not so much, how do I create my own content or whatever, or, working on things that I necessarily agree on. It's the people that the gatekeepers and that kind of stuff I find to be frustrating. But I mean, you also have those issues even in your own family sometimes, family that does not think as critically as you do. And I know at one point I decided like, oh, I just won't deal with those people. I'll just, cut those people off. But then at the same time, it's like, if I can't get through to these more personal relationships, or, closer professional relationships that I have, if I can't get through to them, then how do I expect to get through, to the greater good or whatever? So that's how I try to look at it now when I find myself in frustrating, personal or professional relationships where I'm working, with people, or having to interact with people that don't align with my beliefs. I'm like, okay, well, how can I, potentially get through to them and find a common ground? And, maybe I can be that person that can help change their heart and their point of view, and, whatever the case may be. But, that does get exhausting because it's like, I don't want to be doing that every single day of my life. But I don't know, for me personally, I find like in the industry, it's just like, it's such a wide net of the types of people that you end up running into. It can get a little nutty sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's hard, and I think it's the industry is, what we're seeing there in the micro level is exactly what we're seeing in the country on the macro level, is that there is kind of a stranglehold happening in the traditional outlets within the industry, because the networks and the CEOs and then the major producers are kind of trying to hold on to power and control as Netflix and all these things, and the actors and the creatives get more power. So I think we are seeing kind of a little pushback on specifically diversifying and stuff like that. We saw we're still seeing it, where there was all this push to diversify. So their solutions on network and major films was, we'll just give all the one-line roles to minority actors, and then we'll still have all the leads be white, which is, I guess, a step in the right direction. But it's their way of pushing back. And I think inevitably, like the government and the macro, it's a losing battle, just because the power is shifting, and if they don't adapt, then people will just abandon them and watch Hulu and Netflix and be happy. So I mean, I think there's a demand for that diversity, and they're just being slow to catch up. So yeah.
Do you think, because I think that there's definitely a demand for the diversity, but do you think that people are interested in seeing stories that are not the traditional stories that they're used to, or with leads that are not the traditional protagonists in stories. And the reason I ask that is because, you know, certain people have been making really great television for over a decade that has different, you know, stories and more diverse stories. And what I notice, even just in the people in my personal life who I'm close friends with, white people that I'm close friends with, there's just a complete lack of interest in even watching or exploring these stories. You know, it's just interesting to me that that's what I've seen in my own personal life. So I'm wondering, have you guys seen that at all? And, you know, what do you think? Do you think people are, do you think there's any kind of, any hesitance to seeing diverse stories for people?
I think that the networks ultimately are not going to have a choice because if I'm not mistaken, Atlanta, which is a new show that just came out, is breaking records right now.
Yeah.
Also, Empire was breaking records. It was like which is just, it's like a double-edged sword because Empire is on Fox. And I had such a huge issue with watching it at first. I was like, I do not want to support Fox. Like, of course, you know, all the networks, you know, many of the networks, if not all of the networks, you know, have their iffy tendencies and, you know, because of conglomerates and all that kind of stuff, they're all more or less owned by, you know, the same people or similar organizations. Right. But like, you know, Fox has always been like, oh no, not doing that. And then it was like, I kept hearing how good the show was and I couldn't help but watch. And it's like, you know, even Fox News is being brought to their knees like, oh, wow, there is a huge audience out there for, you know, for shows that primarily feature, you know, people of color. You know, before it was like, I feel like they thought if they put, you know, too many Black people on a show or, you know, too many, you know, people, you know, LGBT on a show or whatever the case may be, that it was just going to be a, you know, a lone Black show or a lone this show or a lone that show. And even like Fresh Off the Boat, you know, that show. It's like, I feel like the networks are being brought to their knees. They're like,
Blackish. It's another.
They're like, oh, wow, people want to see shows, you know, featuring people that look like them. Like, I can't believe it.
Right.
So I feel like they just have no choice.
Yeah. I think I mean, it's like everything else. It's all about profits, you know, and they don't, there's so many levels that it just takes a long time for progress because you have to prove where the profit is. So you have to prove they're not going to diversify until you prove that they will benefit financially off that diversity. And I think also a big difference now is that because there were so many outlets for content, it's not the same criteria of how do we reach the most amount of people and get the most amount of people to watch. It's much more now about branding and going after specific markets because you want to dominate the specific market as opposed to trying to have the broad the broad stroke of everybody, because you're never going to get it. You have Netflix, you have Hulu, you have Amazon, you have all the other things, you have HBO, you just have PlayStation now as its own content. You're just competing with too much. So the idea that you're going to get those millions and millions among millions of viewers like you used to when there were 3 stations isn't going to happen. So I think, everything Janelle's saying, I think it's just coming in a slow wave because they're just now seeing that, oh, Ghostbusters made all this money and it was led by women, and this show has the best ratings at this time and it's dominated by a Black cast. And they're seeing these things, and now you'll see, oh, Fox did it first, now you'll see a similar show on every other network. And then it's just how it's how it goes. But I think it's definitely coming.
Yeah.
I think that answered the question.
Sense. Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
We're like literally, witnessing TV being revolutionized. It's fascinating to watch.
Yeah. And I think it's hard too, like what you were saying about, do you think people want to see those other stories? I'm not. This is speculation because I have seen no research on this whatsoever, but I think maybe it's very subconscious for a lot of people that they do. We see the same thing over and over again, and people think like, "Oh, that's what I like. I want to watch that," and they might be less inclined to watch a show that's all black people if they're white. But I think if they hear, "Oh my God, this show's awesome," and then they watch that show and it's a new experience, I think people are drawn in a lot quicker. But I do think it does kind of take that, because I think of a lot of
That
shows that,
interest.
yeah, a lot of shows
Yeah.
is like, that's not something I would normally watch. And people are just, "Oh, it's great, it's great." And I'm like, okay. And then I'm obsessed with it. I think it's that. And as content diversifies and there's more things, you'll have more of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That helps a lot because I just in my own life I'm like, how are you not watching Empire? It's the best show. It
Yeah.
gets the best ratings. How do you not see this? But I think you're right that there's just kind of a I don't know that I would like this because I've never watched anything like this to know that I would like it. And so, but once people actually, give it a chance, they're more drawn in. Yeah.
I think it's a separation in the racial biases too that, I mean, especially if you're in a town or from a place that isn't very diverse, it's easy to think that our experiences at the core are different when they're really not. Like you think, "Oh, this is a show about black culture, and I'm not going to understand that. I'm not going to relate." And then you watch it and you realize, "Oh, at the core, these are all experiences that I can relate to, at least on a human level."
Right.
And then it's almost an enlightening moment. I can't think, because I have relatively racist family members, and it's very interesting when they have an enlightening moment, and it always comes from TV or film. And it's like, "Oh, I saw," and not even on that. I remember when Modern Family came out, and it totally changed tons of people's perception of what a male gay couple was like, and very humanized that. And I think you see it. So I think it's also a great, without it intentionally being an instrument for change, it really is an instrument for change, because they're human. Even the worst ones are human stories, and people are going to relate. That's the whole point.
I think that just brings that brings this whole conversation full circle, because if you think about what Jesse Williams says, like if you don't know like a black person in real life or an LGBTQ person in real life, and the only representation of that community that is what you see in the media. And traditionally, we know the type of images that are portrayed in the media. Very often, the LGBTQ community was portrayed as being just, this sex-crazed community, as opposed to a very, normal family, that has the same problems that a traditional family has. And then, you would think, blackish, oh, it's just about, the black community or whatever. But no, it's about a family in the United States going through very similar things that, that every family goes through. And, I think it's so important. And I kind of hold the media responsible for many of the views that people have, because they don't tend to do their own research or seek out alternative information or whatever. They only see what's on that tube, So it's so vital, I think, to certain people's intellectual development that these stories exist out there.
Well, and it's interesting because in the with the LGBT rights and gay marriage, who did this study? I can't remember. I'll try to find it. Someone basically, and this is all just it could just be coincidence, but it showed that when Will and Grace, the first year of Will and Grace, is when the trajectory for being against gay marriage started to switch the other direction. And there was really nothing. Yeah, there were the GLAAD and the LGBT organizations were active and stuff, but there wasn't a huge movement. That was really the biggest thing happening, I guess, related to that community. So it's interesting to think that that is what kind of started switching the conversation and changing people's minds. And I just know a lot of people who necessarily weren't even against gay marriage, or they just didn't know any, they didn't think they knew any gay people, and that was a show that really enlightened them or humanized an entire section of our society.
Yeah, I think the media is really can be really instrumental in opening up that space for people to let experiences into their homes that they wouldn't normally allow in. You know, I think that definitely, it makes a lot of sense to me why that, you know, that trend happened, because, you know, GLAAD movement, that's people coming and being active and asking you to pay attention and care about something that you may not have any interest in, but to be, you know, at the end of your day at home and watching a TV show that you like, and then seeing these diverse characters, that makes a lot of sense why that would make a difference. You know, we're our guards are down, we're at home, you know, we're relaxed, we're more open, you know, versus like being out in the world and having conversations with people, or having somebody approach you with a petition to sign for something, you know. So makes sense. And I think that's why content creators and artists are so important, and especially right now that we can really make our own work, you know, and share it.
Yeah, I think that's why you also see such a huge, I mean, you see historic, I don't want to say progressivism, but I guess it is progressivism amongst millennials. You just see a demographic that tends to very drastically think the same, and I think a lot of that has to deal with where their media comes from, and that's news media and entertainment media, because it vastly comes from online sources and streaming content over, I guess, corporate controlled content. And because I often hear, well, the younger generation's always more liberal than than every other generation, but when you look at the numbers, it's never been as overwhelming as it is right now. That was when we were at Politicon, and they had a millennials panel, and I think it was like 6 people, and 5 of them were conservatives. And the whole time I was like, this is weird, not because I'm not a conservative, but because this doesn't actually represent the demographic.
At all.
It was just, it was strange. But that's a different. There's only one person of color, of course, on that panel.
Of course.
So, yeah. Was there any other things you wanted to bring up or ask or discuss?
I think we had a really good conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was great. I thought it was great. I feel like we touched on a lot of things, so I don't have anything else to add.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for both being here. If anyone who's watching has any questions or anything they'd like to ask the panel, shoot us a tweet, and we'll do another one. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Have a good night.
Thanks. Good night.